is Mark Sobel. Today I have the great pleasure of being joined by Bo Lee, Deputy Managing Director of the IMF. Bo has graciously joined me in past years to discuss the IMF's role in climate and look ahead to upcoming COP meetings. This year is no different in the run-up to COP28. I'm going to ask Bo some questions to kickstart the discussions for the first 20-25 minutes. I'll then ask our discussants to offer comments, questions for up to 4 or 5 minutes each. First, a longtime friend and colleague, Kalpana Kokar, a former IMF staff member and now Director of Development Policy and Finance at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Ann Simpson, who is going to join us, Global Head of Sustainability at Franklin Templeton, and Nancy Lee, another longtime colleague and friend from Treasury, now a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development and a member of the G20 expert group on reform of MDB capital adequacy framework and the independent expert group of the G20 on MDB reform commissioned by the Indian G20 presidency. So we'll turn to audience discussion after that. Questions can be submitted in the chat function. And depending on how the session unfolds, I'll either call on the participants directly or pose a question myself. Welcome to Bo Lee and our discussants. Thanks for you joining us for today. So let me
Thank you, Mark, for having me.
It's an honor. Well, let me start with the first question for you. Big picture, I recently saw the UN Global, the climate change stocktake, indicating that whereas world leaders speak of holding the increase in temperature by the end of this century to 1.5 Celsius above pre-industrial levels, in fact, the world now is on track for 2.5 degrees or more. So it seems like a dire outlook to me. Could you give us a quick thumbnail sketch on how the IMF sees the importance of COP28 and what are your main objectives, and then we can drill down.
Thank you, Mark. This is a pivotal moment in the implementation of the Paris Agreement, with the conclusion of the first ever global stocktake. As you note, the world is not on track to meet the Paris Agreement goals. We need to cut global emissions by 25 to 50% by 2030 compared to the pre-2019 levels to contain temperature rise to between 1.5 to 2 degrees Celsius. But according to our calculations, countries' current mitigation targets would only deliver an 11% cut. Given that, we bring 3 high-level messages to COP28. First, we need a response to the global stocktake that prioritizes actions in this decade, decisively increasing ambition and also turning ambition into action. Costs of delay will substantially outweigh the costs of an orderly and just climate transition. Second, we need unprecedented international coordination and collaboration in the policy response to climate change. This challenge is global in nature, and we are more likely to succeed if we work together. And third, the IMF is stepping up its game to support its membership across all our operations, supporting macro resilience, delivering policy advice, and capacity development support to help identify and implement strong climate policies, and provide long-term lending to help address long-term challenges such as climate change in low-income countries and in vulnerable middle-income countries. The global stocktake provides an opportunity to correct course and reaffirm our commitment to addressing the climate challenge in a collaborative manner. As we do so, let me highlight several priorities. First, we need to revise national determined contribution targets for 2030 to increase ambition in an equitable manner. Second, concrete commitments on monitorable mitigation actions are needed. For instance, implementation could be accelerated globally via agreements on minimum carbon prices or equivalent measures among major large emitters. Third, drastic increases in mitigation investments and adaptation investments are needed, requiring policies to shift private sector incentives. Given the limited fiscal space in many vulnerable countries, international assistance will be necessary. Coordinated efforts by IFIs, MDBs, private investors, and country authorities and donors are needed to mobilize climate finance. And finally, there is a large potential for emissions reduction from upgrading current technology in emerging market and developing countries to low carbon technology, LCT. This requires a comprehensive and coordinated approach to overcome domestic and external barriers to technological diffusion. Thank you, Mark. I stop here.
Well, thank you. That you have outlined a very tall agenda, so maybe we can dig into a good bit of that today with you. So the fund is known for its excellence in economic analysis. You alluded to this already, but fund economists agree that a carbon price is the most effective tool to tackle climate change. In past years, the fund put forward the idea of differentiated set of carbon prices. I think it was $25 a ton for India, 75 for the US and Europe, maybe 50 for China. But progress is falling woefully short on that. Last year, you told me the effective global carbon price was $3 per ton. And then I saw recently that the fund projected that fossil fuel subsidies were on the order of $7 trillion. Global GDP is about 100 trillion, if my memory is correct. So that's almost 7% of global GDP. So what's your message to the world about these realities? And in the US, there doesn't seem much appetite for a carbon price, but there are other measures being pursued. So how does the IMF feel about second best remedies and their efficacy and whether they can get the job done?
Thank you, Mark. Carbon pricing schemes are expanding globally and have doubled its coverage of global emissions since 2015. But the progress is too slow. The global average carbon price remains far too low at $5 per ton now. Ideally, carbon pricing should be the centerpiece of countries' mitigation strategies. Carbon pricing provides across-the-board incentives to reduce energy use and shift towards cleaner fuels, and also provide the price signals that is critical for leveling the playing field for clean technologies. Carbon pricing can also significantly improve fiscal imbalances. Even after funding compensation for vulnerable groups and public investments in clean technology and infrastructure. In contrast, strategies that rely heavily on spending measures, such as increasing public investment and subsidies for renewable energies, can entail large fiscal costs. As we show in the latest fiscal monitor, relying mostly on spending-based measures to reach net zero goals by mid-century will become increasingly costly, possibly raising public debt by 45 to 50% of GDP by 2050 for a representative large emitting country, and could put public debt on an unsustainable path. A comprehensive strategy is needed to enhance the effectiveness of carbon pricing. This could include the following measures. Revenues from carbon pricing should be used to boost the economy in a way that benefits all households. For example, in investments in SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals. Robust assistance is also needed for vulnerable households, workers, and regions. Carbon pricing should also be phased in gradually to give firms and households time to adjust and in consultation with key stakeholders. And carbon pricing should also initially focus on energy-related CO2 emissions, but as capacity is developed, carbon pricing could be applied to other sectors like forestry, agriculture, and extractives. At the same time, a pragmatic balance needs to be struck between carbon pricing and reinforcing instruments at the sectoral level. The latter are less efficient from an economic perspective, but they could help avoid politically difficult tax burdens on the average households and firms. For example, many countries have integrated fee-based into their vehicle tax systems. And the same instrument can be applied to other sectors like industry, buildings, power generation, and forestry. All in all, a well-designed policy package will have carbon pricing as an integral component and be complemented with public investment support and sectoral policies such as fee-based or tradable performance standards. The policy mix will seek to balance cost effectiveness, political feasibility, and budgetary impact. In addition, coordination among large emitters could facilitate a rapid scaling up of mitigation at the international level. Our staff have proposed an international carbon price floor, which sets higher prices for developed than developing countries. In addition, our policy advice would also allow for emissions equivalent approaches to carbon pricing, as Mark, you just alluded to, because we realize carbon tax can be difficult politically in many countries. And we support what we call carbon price equivalent policies, such as emissions trading, regulatory approach, and even green subsidy. Of course, taking into account what I just discussed on potential burden on public debt. And finally, we also need transparent assistance for energy transitions in low-income countries in order to support them to move to a net zero scenario. I stop here.
So for the emerging markets and developing countries, private sector finance must play the key role to help achieve net zero. Chapter 3 of the latest GFSR observed that the private sector must put up 80 to 90% of the $2 trillion annually by 2030 of those needs. I think that's an IEA estimate. Last year, when we chatted, we discussed the 2022 GFSR chapter on scaling up private finance for climate in emerging markets, which discussed opportunities through new instruments and broadening the investor base. So what's your take on whether the private sector is willing to come to the table in such magnitude, and how is it going so far?
Thank you for this question, Mark. The 2022 and 2023 GFSR chapters on climate finance in emerging market and developing countries outline the hurdles to private investment more generally, and also climate investments more specifically. We see three priorities in this space if we want to crowd in private capital and scale up climate finance. The first priority, we think, is policy reforms. We need to support emerging market and developing countries to put together a policy environment to support climate investment. That could include a carbon pricing, but also that could include other measures in the financial sector that can remove hurdles to climate investment. The second priority we see is capacity building and technical assistance. A key constraint to private sector investment at a large scale remains the availability of bankable projects. Much more bankable projects are needed, and the facilities to pool investments would help to increase scale. But in this regard, we need to support emerging market and developing countries to develop a pipeline of bankable projects. And this requires capacity building This requires technical assistance. And the third priority, we think, is de-risking arrangements. The private sector is generally willing to take credit risks, but they expect to have de-risking support for sovereign risk and FX risk. More blended finance structures are needed to reduce these risks and thereby cut financing costs. Public sector needs to take more risk, for example, by providing more equity or providing guarantees. For another example, in renewable energy sector, upfront capital investments are very high, and the financing costs are often too high in emerging market and developing countries to make renewable energy investment more attractive than existing fossil fuel energy production. International efforts, such as the Just Energy Transition Partnerships, JETPs, offer some promise towards structuring financial packages for renewable energies. I stop here.
Thank you for that. Maybe you could help me sort through some confusion in my mind. So the IMF is a macro organization, but it has a shorter term focus, and clearly climate change has a macro dimension, as we've discussed. But the World Bank has responsibility for projects and structural reforms. President Bonga and the managing director recently issued a statement on the fund bank roles in climate change. So maybe I could ask you a question about what is the fund's role in climate change, and to put it provocatively, I wanted to ask you how you responded to a recent speech by Treasury Under Secretary Jay Shambaugh that he gave at CGD. Nancy was the moderator for that event. So he said the fund can respond to climate, for example, by helping countries reduce subsidies, strengthen macro frameworks to mobilize domestic resources, technical assistance, and lending, for example, via the Resilience and Sustainability Trust. I'm sure you agree with that. But he said also, and I'm going to quote him, that the IMF should not be experts on climate issues. Instead, it should focus on macro critical issues and rely on the World Bank and others for sectoral expertise. In short, solving major world challenges should involve reinforcing the core mandate, not straying from it. So how do you see the fund's role in climate change, and what's your response to Jay's ending quote there?
Thank you, Mark, for that question. I'm sure this question is on the minds of some of the audience here. Why is IMF working on climate? I think by taking a macro approach and also take a longer term approach and focusing on improved macro policy frameworks, the IMF is filling a gap that is not covered by institutions focused on project financing. And this is within our mandate and within our expertise. In fact, climate issues have become integral to our work, including surveillance, capacity building, and lending. Let me give you a couple of examples. In surveillance, our regular program and surveillance work helps countries improve their macroeconomic stability and their policy and investment framework that will help attract climate and development finance. But even more than that, we are working on incorporating climate into our regular surveillance work, both bilateral surveillance and the multilateral surveillance. For example, in Article 4 consultation, we are now incorporating mitigation policy in large emitters, the top 20 emitters of the world. We are now looking at their mitigation policy and how those policies could impact their macroeconomic and financial stability. For another example, for climate vulnerable countries, including middle income and low income countries that are susceptible to climate disasters, we are now incorporating adaptation policies into our regular Article 4 consultation, because we realize adaptation efforts are key for these countries to build long-term macro resilience. For one more example, on FSAP, we are now incorporating climate into our stress testing for financial institutions. So these are all our regular surveillance work. In the second area, in terms of technical assistance and capacity development, we help countries build technical capacity relating to climate in a range of areas, including fiscal policy, such as green PFM, CPMA, and other fiscal tools. Capacity building efforts also include macroeconomic modeling, financial sector analysis, and statistics. So we are incorporating climate into a lot of our CD, our capacity development support to our members. And finally, in terms of lending, few other institutions provide policy lending for climate. And we have this new instrument, RSF, that will support countries to implement reforms so that they can build long-term resilience in their macroeconomic and financial policy framework. And in addition to that, our RSF is also acting as a catalyst to help countries to scale up climate finance. I stop here.
Thank you for that. Let me, if I could ask though, the boundaries between the bank and the fund, and maybe we'll get into this more in the discussion. But how do you see those boundaries, and do you see the bank and the fund as fully coordinated with respect to those areas?
Yes, we are closely coordinating with the banks. We see our role as more complementary because, as I said, we focus on the macro aspect and the bank focus on project financing. So our policy lending can certainly be a complement to the policy, to the project lending, right? We have policy lending and they have project lending. And we work together to think about how to help countries, both in terms of implementing policy, in terms of increasing capacity, but also in terms of scale up climate finance. In fact, in all the RSF countries, we are working together, both in terms of designing the RSF program, designing the conditionality to our program, but also in terms of how to build their capacity together, and also how to scale up climate finance by working as a team.
Okay, there's plenty to dig into there. Let me just ask you a last question before turning to the commenters and discussants. Since you've mentioned the RSF, the Resilience and Sustainability Facility, it's a major plank of the fund's efforts to help countries address climate issues. I've seen a lot of commitments to it recently, so maybe you can tell us about the RSF in greater detail and how it's coming along. So please.
Thank you, Mark, for that question. The Resilience and Sustainability Trust, RST, has now been operational for 1 year. Already, the board has approved 11 countries to receive support under this new trust, RST. And these 11 programs are providing over $5.7 billion in terms of long-term affordable financing to support these 11 countries in their building of long-term resilience. And we have also received commitments from many developed countries and also large emerging market countries to support this trust. And the commitment we have received so far have reached $40 billion. The RSF, Resilience and Sustainability Facility, provide long-term financing at affordable costs. It supports policy reforms that mitigate macro-critical risks linked to climate change and create an environment that can help scale up climate finance. In particular, RSF programs have sought to prioritize comprehensive reforms targeted at country-specific challenges. Programs have emphasized reforms in areas where the fund has expertise. This includes integrating climate consideration into public investment management and PPP frameworks, green public financial management, such as the budget preparation, execution, and reporting, and auditing, risk assessments, such as macro-fiscal, macro-financial, and disaster risks, and energy transition measures, such as renewables and energy efficiency. In addition to policy reforms, given the substantial climate financing needs of emerging market and developing countries, no single institution can provide the financing at the required scale. So as such, in addition to our policy advice and financial support through RSF arrangements, we have been working together with our partners, IFIs, MDBs, bilateral donors, and private sector partners to convene roundtables within RSF countries. And these roundtables basically gather, as I said, partners, IFIs, MDBs, bilateral donors together to try to identify and also explore solutions to climate finance challenges. So in that sense, RSF is trying to play a catalytic role. For example, Rwanda, the first RSF countries, was able to attract additional budget financing commitments and has also set up a green fund facility to crowd in more climate finance, both from public sector and also from private sector. I stop here.
Well, thank you for all of that. I'm going to turn to the discussants who are far more knowledgeable about these issues than I am. So, Kalpana from Nairobi, could you start us off? The floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you, Mark, and greetings to everyone from Nairobi. Bo, I was very happy to hear about your discussions around climate adaptation. As you know, I'm with the Gates Foundation now, and we have, a focus on the poorest countries. And of course, mitigation actions in these countries are going to amount to nothing because they don't actually they haven't contributed much, and whatever actions they take will do nothing to move the needle on greenhouse gas emissions. So I am happy to hear that the advice is being tailored. I remain a little bit concerned, though, that it's not just because of the fund, but just this is with the focus on mitigation, that even I'm sitting here in Kenya, and there's a lot of focus still on attracting money for green energy, which I'm not sure is actually the highest need here. But I think that's what they want to do because that's where they think the money is right now. So it's not just the fund, but I did want to make that point. But I do have two questions. One is, and both, forgive me, both of them are going to be a little bit colored by where I'm sitting now and the meetings I've had the last few days. One is the increase in fossil fuel subsidies that Mark referred to, and the strong feeling that there's a huge double standard, that Kenya is just now, I think, very close to agreeing the next review and whatnot, and is being forced to do big cuts in subsidies and probably increases in other countries as well. And so how do we address that concern about double standards, one? And the second question is on debt. And again, as I said, previewed, sorry for speaking very much from the lens of the country that I'm sitting in right now. they are absolutely consumed by what's going to happen in the next 12 months with the debt payments that are coming up. And they are also really quite unsatisfied with the state of play on debt relief currently. I mean, what's happened in the few countries that have had net negotiations doesn't give them a whole lot of confidence that something will be worked out. And and many of them feel, and many of them feel in this country that Kenya is a little bit of a bellwether, so how the way Kenya goes, so goes the rest of the low-income countries. So those were 2 questions. I'll stop there.
Nancy, let's hear from Nancy, and then we'll give Bo time to respond. So Nancy, please.
Thanks, Mark. Very happy to join this conversation. I've been spending, as you mentioned earlier, months working on various aspects of reform of multilateral development banks. So great to have an opportunity to comment on the fund's really critical role. And I completely agree with Bo's analysis on the macro critical, the very well-founded fit between the fund's role and its role in climate resilience in particular. After all, the fund has always been about strengthening macroeconomic fundamentals and supporting, fiscal, monetary, financial policy choices that promote sustained and sustainable growth, as well as stability, and supporting, domestic resource mobilization. It would be a little odd if the fund did not at the same time seek to strengthen choices on public expenditure, including choices that lower long-term risks to growth. So I see building resilience to externally driven shocks in particular as fitting squarely within that realm. That being said, I think we're still at a moment where it's not entirely clear where the fund will have its greatest and best impact in this sphere. So I just wanted to go through the various channels that the fund has, the various instruments and various activities, and kind of assess where it's likely to have the most impact. And that's finance, its policy conditionality, its surveillance, and its debt sustainability analysis. It may be that the fund's own finance role, particularly through the RSF, may not be the strongest channel for impact. Even if all of the resources now being committed to the RST are deployed, we know it's a drop in the bucket compared to the trillions necessary to meet the challenges of global public good investments. And I have a little bit of a concern that the staff time and effort needed to actually get programs negotiated and improved is large in relation to the volume of resources on offer. And that's particularly because of the requirement that RSF resources be committed in the context of upper credit tranche programs from the fund. My colleagues at CGD report that to exhaust the total volume of RSF or RST resources, even in its proposed expanded volume, the IMF would have to negotiate at least 16 more upper credit tranche programs, each taking 6 to 8 months. So we're talking about a lot of effort for a relatively limited amount of money, which sort of brings us to the question of conditionality. The combination of upper credit tranche conditionality with RSF conditionality means that there's a proliferation of numbers of conditions. We saw in the Costa Rica program, for example, a tripling of the number of conditions needed for access to IMF finance. But of course, we know that the impact of conditionality is not a function of numbers, it's a function of the quality of conditionality. So the fund will have to manage the risk that the time and effort expended in negotiating both these RSF conditions and for countries without upper credit tranche programs, new upper credit tranche programs, has to generate commensurate long-term resilience results. And in addition to that, much of the conditionality that Bo was discussing, to me, sounds very similar to the kinds of conditionality that the World Bank and the other MDBs negotiate in the context of policy-based lending. So separate from investment project lending, there is very similar conditionality. So really there is a challenge, and Bo mentioned this as he was describing the landscape, to try to bring this kind of conditionality together in a coherent way in support of both greater impact and helping countries really establish their priorities and not be pulled in different directions by the different financial institutions. On surveillance, as Bo said, now it's a routine part of Article 4 surveillance. That's a great thing. It's going to require a lot more climate data, more tools to understand and quantify climate impacts, and more climate expertise inside the IMF as well as in the countries themselves. But the fund does not have to reinvent the wheel here, or at least the entire wheel. It can, as Bo was mentioning, join with experts in the World Bank and the regional development banks. You know, the fund has now, as I understand it, climate policy diagnostics and climate investment public management assessment. The World Bank has the climate and development, the country climate and development reports, the CCDRs. It seems kind of reasonable to have some cross-institutional consolidation of these diagnostics into one or maybe fewer different documents. On debt sustainability, others have proposed that the fund incorporate net gains and losses from spending decisions on potential growth and debt sustainability. Climate-related investments, resilience-related investment deserve, I think, special attention in DSAs, given their disproportionate impact on risks and on growth potential in a growing number of countries. So I think that proposal has a lot of merit. So with that as context, just let me make several suggestions on reforms that might be considered at this kind of critical juncture in the RST/RSF journey. The first is how about making the RST resources quicker and easier. For countries with strong climate strategies, perhaps access could be offered to a limited share of quota, maybe 25% of quota, without a concurrent upper credit tranche program. This, of course, would require a change in the view of a number of major shareholders. I think speed and ease of access, especially given how off track we are on climate objectives, is very reasonable to consider at this point. And with respect to conditionality, and this is something that is a very live topic in the MDB reform world, it seems the time to bring together all of this conditionality in one country-owned strategy, so that you have a set of policy commitments by countries, including on their adaptation and resilience goals, which could form the basis of RSF conditionality. It could also form the basis of MDB policy reform conditionality, and it also could serve as one of the important areas of consideration in funds surveillance. So instead of negotiating all of this conditionality for each of these institutions and for each of these purposes, to bring together resilient policy statement as a basis for all of this kind of support. It is consistent with the JETP kind of approach, and that seems to be the best way to have a country-owned approach that at the same time is associated with a coherent set of conditions. Just two more things. One is just to reemphasize the point about investments in resilience as part of DSA analysis. And then just to mention the sort of forgotten area of resilience, which is resilience to pandemic and other health shocks. It seems this is the time to start really incorporating that into the RST and the RSF. Thanks.
Thank you. That was fantastic, Nancy. So, Bo, I'm going to let you respond. And now you can see why Nancy was one of my tough interlocutors at Treasury for a long time. And so, Bo, floor is yours, and audience, you're invited to submit questions or flag your willingness to appear on screen and ask questions after Bo responds.
Thank you, Kalpana and Nancy. I think these are all very pertinent and very important questions. In fact, we are also trying to, even internally, to debate and find answers to many of these questions. Let me go through these questions relatively quickly with some very brief observations first, and of course, these questions will continue to be discussed in the next, weeks and months. The first one is on the fossil fuel subsidies and the perception of double standards by many developing countries, and we can certainly see why there are frustrations and dissatisfaction with the discussion on fossil fuel. I think for us, for IMF, what we try to do is to be even-handed and to be consistent in our message. So that means, regardless who's doing that subsidy, you can be a high-income country or you can be a low-income country. But our message is consistent that fossil fuel subsidies are the worst kind of subsidies for climate, and there are better ways to support the vulnerable group without distorting the price on fossil fuel. And of course, there is a challenge of capacity in many low-income countries in terms of direct support to targeted support to vulnerable groups. That is why we are working with them to build capacity, to find ways to do better in terms of supporting the vulnerable group without distorting the price of carbon. So this is a challenging task, as you can see. But we are keeping our efforts, and we are continuing to try and work with our member countries. So that's the first question. The second on the debt challenge, and that is very relevant for our climate discussion. Let me quickly offer two observations on that front. One is on the debt treatment. The common framework, the G20 common framework, has been there for more than a couple of years now, and we have seen a number of countries going through that process. Of course, the process has been slow, and many countries are feeling that this process need to be improved, need to give more confidence to the international community. But the good news is that the process is getting better and shorter. I think when we started, like countries like Chad, it took like 2 years to get to the MOU. Now it takes like 6 months or 4 months. For Sri Lanka, it's like less than 6 months. Of course, Sri Lanka is not a common framework country, but it's similar. We have common framework countries, low-income countries, but we also have middle-income countries like Sri Lanka. We are working out in a similar fashion. And the IMF is working very closely with World Bank and the international community to try to continue to support that process and also to make it more streamlined and more transparent and more predictable. And we also formed a roundtable called Global Sovereign Debt Roundtable, chaired by our MD, Kristalina, and also World Bank president, and also G20 chair. So this roundtable, we brought together, both the traditional Paris Club countries, but also the new lenders like China, India, and Saudi, and also the debtors, the borrowers, countries from Africa, countries from low-income countries. We invited, and also private sector lenders. We invited everyone to the roundtable so that we can discuss what are the challenges and how to work together to tackle those challenges. And I think this process has been working out, even though slowly, but we are hoping that it will get better and better in trying to providing the kind of debt relief that is needed for many developing countries and low-income countries. My second observation on this debt challenge is that in relation to climate, we think that international community also need to work together to find ways to support climate investment without creating another debt crisis. So that's a challenge that the international community has to work together to think about and to explore innovative solutions. For example, how can we come up with more equity, right? Because there is already too much debt in developing countries, in emerging markets. How can we come up with more equity? How can we find more equity investors? How can public sector support private sector equity investors into the climate space in emerging market and developing countries? There are many ways to think about. Also, another example will be like debt for climate swap. How can we use innovative solutions like debt for climate swap to support climate transition without creating more debt burden? And another example will be carbon credit market, the international market for carbon credit. How can we make that market work so that we can provide more financing to emerging market and developing countries, again, without creating more debt burden? So there are many potential areas that we can work on so that we can scale up climate finance without creating more debt, without creating excessive debt burden. So that's my two quick observations on the debt issue and climate. On Nancy's observations and suggestions, I think these suggestions are very good, very innovative. We will have a midterm review of the RSF, RST, I think by April. We committed to have a midterm review after 18 months. So by April or May, we should have an opportunity to review our RST, RSF programs, and also to think how to make our instrument more useful and more streamlined and more accessible. I think these are all the questions on our mind as well in terms of how to make this new instrument more effective in supporting our member countries. A couple of quick observations in relation to that. One is, how do we view the kind of benefits generated by RSF program? Of course, the money we provide is very limited. So how do we evaluate the benefits, right? So the way we see it is that the amount of financing may be limited, but we really care about the kind of policy reform that this program can support, because those policy reform can have long-lasting impact on the member countries, both mitigation and adaptation efforts. So that's why a lot of these benefits of these programs, we would suggest we do not focus on the amount of financing, because the amount of financing, true, is limited. But we need to think about the catalytic role that the policy reform could generate. Another observation is on the conditionalities. And as we are learning in this process, you can see that our conditionalities are becoming better and become more targeted and also become more, hopefully, more effective in helping our member countries to build climate resilience. And I very much support the idea that we should work with MDBs. We should work with our partners in designing this conditionality. And we should try to avoid duplication. We should also try to avoid pulling our member countries to different directions. So we are working very closely with World Bank and other regional MDBs in designing our conditionality. We rely very heavily on World Bank's CCDR, in fact. So not only conditionality should be consolidated, the kind of diagnostic tools should also be consolidated as suggested by Nancy. So we don't have, we don't need to rebuild or redo the CCDR analysis because we already have World Bank doing the CCDR. And we bring our own tool only if they are not available in other MDBs on the more macro aspect of the diagnostic analysis. So again, we are working very closely with our MDB partners. And finally, in terms of climate finance, we try to design our conditionality so that will catalyze more climate finance. And that again is very much consistent with the goal of MDBs. So we work together from the early stage of program design and also in the process of program implementation. As I said, we also organize roundtables with MDB partners and bilateral donors to think about how to leverage our respective expertise, how to leverage our respective programs together, produce synergy so that we can crowd in more climate finance in a very innovative fashion, as I said, because we want to crowd in more equity investment. We want to crowd in more private sector equity investors. And we also want to use more innovative solutions like debt for climate swap, like market for carbon credit, so that we can generate more climate finance without creating new debt burdens. And this will require closer collaboration among both multilateral institutions and also bilateral donors. I stop here.
Well, thank you. I should say I'm learning a bunch of new acronyms today, so that's always a good experience. You mentioned one thing since we started talking about debt. One concern I have about the RSF is that, as is inherent to the financial structure of the trust, it lends at market interest rates more or less. There are some variations for income levels and whatnot, but obviously the PRGT, the low-income countries, get lending from the IMF at a zero interest rate, and there are not enough subsidy resources for the PRGT to really continue going at zero. So I think that makes the RST a lot less attractive to low-income countries. And I've been calling for the world to step up in terms of delivering subsidy resources to the PRGT. And I think that's a very important point I just wanted to make. You mentioned just transition at the beginning of in our discussion. In past years, there's been this commitment or objective from advanced economies to provide $100 billion a year for countries to finance this transition. Probably a drop in the bucket, but be that as it may, even that objective hasn't been met in recent years. I mean, do you have any thoughts on that for us?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Just two quick reactions to your comments. One is on the PRGT versus RST. True. Right now, the RST interest rate look not as attractive as PRGT, because PRGT is zero interest rate. And the good news is that in Marrakesh, we have reached our goal of raising additional subsidy additional subsidy resources for PRGT. This current phase of fundraising, we have reached our goal, and more than 40 countries contributed to that subsidy account, including both advanced economies and also many emerging markets. So we had a very broad support to scale up our PRGT financing at 0 interest rate. And for RST, we are going to review again, by April and May. We're going to review our RST financing arrangements, including the interest rates for low-income countries. And we definitely hear from our low-income countries in terms of the cost of RST financing. And I think all options are on the table in terms of how to lower that RST financing costs to make it more attractive and more beneficial to our low-income country members. And that's certainly on the table. In terms of the 100 billion commitment from wealthy countries, we are, like you, we are closely watching, and hopefully by the end of this year, maybe for the first time, the advanced economy will reach that goal of $100 billion for the first time in history, and we will see if that happens. But of course, this $100 billion is only very small compared to the needs. That's why we think at COP28 we need to think very hard in terms of how to scale up climate finance at affordable rates and without creating another heavy burden in terms of debt. Right. So climate finance, we definitely need to be think very creatively and also be very ambitious at COP28 if we want to make a difference at scale. I stop here.
Good. So there is an audience question from Federico Cibaja of Recourse, and he'd like to ask about your vision for climate work in the upcoming years and in light of the upcoming climate change strategy review. What do you think has worked and what hasn't? The CMAP review is a sign that the strategy will lead to a narrow role for the fund on climate, ?
Yes, we are reviewing our existing tools, including CMAP, and this is in light of, as Nancy mentioned, we have many MDBs are also offering different tools in terms of diagnostics and surveillance, and we are trying to figure out what's our strengths and what's our expertise. And for tools like CMAP and other similar tools, we'll try to figure out what kind of synergy we can produce with other MDBs. If for example, if CCDR already covers certain areas, we don't need to duplicate, right? So we want to make our tools to fill any gap that is missing, but not duplicating. So and also we need to consider the resource constraints that we face. Given the high demand from our members on RST and RSF, we will try to reorient some of our tools to support our RST and our RSF program. And because of that, our CMAP and other tools will be reoriented, at least for the next several years, so that we can provide focused support for our members, in particular in connection with our RST and our RSF operation. I stop here.
Well, great. Well, you stopped at the appropriate time because our hour is over. So I would like to offer my tremendous thanks again to Deputy Managing Director Bo Lee of the IMF for explaining the fund's role and your outlook on COP28. I thank Kalpana Kokar and Nancy Lee for being provocative and offering such good questions. I wish you a successful COP28 and a good day to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Bo.
Thank you, Mark. Thank you, Kalpana and Nancy.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.